Appreciate you joining us here to discuss the opportunity to give feedback on our civil space technology shortfalls. I am Allison Lowry. I'm the Director of Strategic Planning and Integration in STMD, and our team has been busy assembling this initial list of technology shortfalls. Your feedback on the importance of these shortfalls is critical. And despite our best efforts to establish an all-encompassing list of shortfalls, we're confident it is not a complete set, so we also want to hear from you on what we're missing. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few logistics. So this webinar today is being recorded and will be available for replay on nasa.gov in a few days. All participants will be in a listen-only mode until the Q&A portion. So throughout the presentation, you can submit questions via the WebEx Q&A function. To open Q&A, press the three dots in the lower right-hand corner of your web screen. You can also raise your hand to ask a question verbally during the Q&A portion. And we will call on hand raisers by name, and you can then unmute your microphone. Please remember to lower your hand once your question has been answered. If we do not get to all the questions, you can also email us for a response. So there are several important links on the screen, but the most important, which we will remind you of several times, is spacetechpriorities.org, which is the site where we are collecting your feedback. For those NASA folks on the call, you're welcome to stay on, but we just did want to note that we are collecting input from NASA civil servants and NASA contractors through a separate platform called NASA Spark, and there is a NASA Spark Teams webinar tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern that will cover more specifics about using that platform. However, please note that the scoring criteria and the open-ended questions are the same on both platforms. So now I'm going to hand it off to our Associate Administrator for Space Technology, Spuds Vogel, and STMD's Acting Chief Architect, Michelle Monk, they will both discuss the overall strategy, initial shortfall list, and inaugural feedback mechanism. So over to you, Spuds.
Thanks, Allison. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. This is a big day for us because we're getting this process started with you all, because it doesn't work without your participation. I mean, we can do these, set these shortfall priorities on our own, but that wouldn't be very useful in terms of forming an audit trail and talking to our stakeholders from your needs. What do you think that needs to be, the problems that need to be solved from the folks that make up the entire ecosystem for civil space? So what we're doing, just so you understand, we are pivoting away. I mean, we want to figure out how to set our priorities within the tech base, how to best service our stakeholders in human exploration, science, and other government agencies. Derivatively, also, our stakeholders that help us accomplish those objectives that are in industry, academia, the centers, et cetera. So there's hopefully you're coming from some place in the ecosystem where you appreciate what it is we're trying to do here. We want to pivot away from trying to set our priorities based on, as I have said, sort of using more sophomoric language of being enamored with the widgets, being enamored with the solution space of, we've got this program or this project or whatnot, and then trying to set priorities just by simply looking at those. Instead, we want to roll it back even further, go further to the right, if you will, to look at what the problem space is for our stakeholders. What are the problems we're trying to solve? And to do that, you have to look at it in a couple of dimensions. First off, there's the ideas that come in, and that's usually, go ahead and do. So usually there's the ideas that we come up with either at our centers here at NASA, with our industry partners, other agencies and whatnot. We'll come up with ideas. And that's the trade space where that's the solution side, but that's not necessarily where we want to set the priorities. What we want to do, go ahead and pivot to, is look at it from the shortfalls. Some people will call them the gaps. The only reason we're not using the term gaps going forward is usually you have to define both sides of a gap, and not always do you have both sides defined. So we're using the term shortfalls to say, hey, this is an area that is problematic. Now, at some point, though, we need to prioritize those shortfalls, right? And that's where you come in. I'll come back to that. That's what this whole process is about. But just to give you a flavor of where we're going with this is we want to then wash the new ideas against that prioritized list of shortfalls once we have them prioritized. Now, this is a notional heat map you're looking at. There'd probably be a lot less green on it in the final one that we'd use. But imagine a column, and you're not supposed to read any of the numbers on this. It's more of just to give you an idea of what we're doing with it. Imagine any given column in that heat map. That represents an investment idea, a project or a program idea that we'd invest in, and you then associate it with the various shortfalls that we've identified. And as has been mentioned, we've got 187 shortfalls that we've identified thus far. So if you've got an idea in the solution space, you basically map it, and we'll be producing the mapping mechanism that we're going to use, how you map from the investments into the shortfalls. But once you've done that mapping and say, okay, this idea for sharks with lasers, that's how we're going to map to solving this particular problem, for example, right? That is when what you can use is if you've done that for all of your investments, if you look at the bottom, the summations of the bottom side of that heat map, go ahead and do the build, that gives us a tool to prioritize, use a prioritization tool to prioritize our investments from the things that are the most impactful all the way back to the shortfalls on the left-hand side over there, all the way down to the things that are least impactful, but they all are having an impact to some degree on the shortfall lists. So historically, that listing you're seeing on the right-hand side, that's usually where we've lived, is we were prioritizing just straight at that list of widgets, of projects, investments. What we're doing is we're rolling it back and washing those investments through the prioritized shortfalls. And so to get help on that, that's where you all come in. Just before and one more thing I'll show you, so go ahead and do the build. So what we do is we would use nominally these prioritized investments then to help inform our roadmaps, nominally, right? Another way we can do this is if you look at across the rows of that heat map. That's basically when you look across our entire portfolio and say and given any particular shortfall in the vertical list on the left-hand side, if you were to look across and say, how are we doing as a portfolio against attacking those problems? So for example, you can kind of see if you, it's not, you don't read it, but you can kind of see across maybe the fourth one down in this notional map, the fourth highest prioritized thing notionally is red over on the side. Why? Because there's no green. There's nothing where we're attacking that problem across our entire portfolio. So you basically would use that as information as a leader to feed back into the idea generation machine for you all and us to help come up with new ideas to enter into the investment portfolio that then gets rated in future years. So this whole thing is designed to be a publicly transparent, rigorously developed process by which we're going to establish our priorities based on your needs, right? So that's what we're asking you to do here. This whole thing anchors on your needs. What are the problems we're trying to solve? So there's a misnomer that usually happens. Hey, we want you to work on this particular technology. Well, the only time you're going to speak to us in terms that we want you to talk in terms of this solution is when it's so closely associated with the problem that they're almost one and the same. That doesn't happen very often. That's a very heavy tech push thing. Yes, we know we have a problem, but we also have done work over the years. We know that this is the only solution. So you push us on a particular technology solution. In those particular cases, the problem and the widget, if you will, are very similar. But for the most part, the problem space is very unique, and you're going to state it as such, as the problem we're trying to solve. So what we did here at STMD is Allison and her team and our chief architect, Michelle Monk, got an initial list. We had to get this process started since it's intended to be an annual process. We wanted to take a first hack at this. So we worked with our friends in both science and human exploration, as well as the strategy team here with STMD, and took a first stab at what the leveled shortfalls would be. We started with a list of about 800 what was formerly known as gaps, but they ranged anywhere from very large things that you could drive a truck through, the large categorical areas, as well as very detailed, heavy on the metrics, very detailed gaps. What we did is instead leveled those out to 187 shortfalls where they were comparable to one another. And that's what you're seeing here broken up. There's 187 broken up into various capability areas. We also had some miscellaneous ones there that didn't neatly fall or group together cleanly. But each one of these, when you go to the link, you will see each one of these shortfalls explained in more detail. There's a paragraph on the left-hand side of these charts, as well as on the right-hand side. There are derivative shortfalls or child shortfalls that fall underneath the main shortfall category. So we're asking everybody to take a look at these and then score them. And just so that you know, what we're doing with these is that, as I mentioned on the previous chart, we're going to take those shortfalls, we're going to produce the results, not just in one convolved list of this is what everybody said, which we're going to do that, but we're also going to produce the results by stakeholder category. And so those results will be available to everyone. And that way you can see not just what do the different parts of the government think, what do we think in the tech base, what do our stakeholders think in human exploration and science, but also what did the rest of industry think? What did academia think? So you can even see what your own community, how you addressed each of these shortfalls as far as the level of impact or importance. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Michelle to explain more where we are on the process and what you can do.
Sure, thank you, Spuds. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so here is a look at our landing page. When you go to the QR code or spacetechpriorities.org, this is where you'll register so that we can identify your stakeholder group and the type of organization that you're coming from. And of course, as you've heard, since we're having this webinar, the feedback mechanism opened for responses actually yesterday. We will keep it open until May 13th. And then, as Spuds mentioned, we plan to publish our results this summer. So as you're coming into our landing page here, we just wanted to note a few things to consider aggregating input from your company or organization into one response so that we don't have 50 responses from the same organization. Score the shortfalls related to your expertise. That's going to be most impactful and will have the most informed responses. Keeping in mind that you don't have to rate all of the shortfalls. 187 is a lot, and you saw the technology area list on the previous page. And so if you don't score a shortfall or you don't feel qualified to rate it, it will default to not applicable or no opinion. And there's also, you'll see on the scoring rubric in a minute, a 0 choice, and that 0 should be reserved for those areas where you believe the shortfall is not important or that a shortfall or solution exists for that shortfall. So distinction there between not applicable or no opinion, and then 0 if you really think it's not important. And then at the end of the survey, we have 3 opportunities for open-ended question responses, and I'll show you those as well as we go through here. Next slide, please. So here's what the registration page looks like in the very beginning of the feedback mechanism. So we have identifying information over on the left. And again, it's really important for you to identify your organizational type, and that'll allow us to aggregate the responses of each stakeholder group. After you register, you'll come to the beginning of the feedback mechanism on the right, which gives you the outline of the capability or technology areas that you saw on the previous page. And you can use this to navigate through the feedback mechanism. Next slide, please. Then when you get into the feedback mechanism, first want to note that you can, you'll see a progress bar at the top. You can save and close the survey at any time, the form. And then when you're ready, you're all finished with your responses, you would hit the submit feedback button here. You can use this list on the left of the page to navigate by capability area. So if you're only interested in one or two of these areas, you can do that by clicking on the left. And then you may also go to the open-ended text feedback questions at the end of the form. Each page will look like the example here. So each shortfall has an ID number, and that might be important as you're looking through the different titles, and you go to our reference of the one pagers that Spud showed on the previous page. You'll have the title, and then for each question, it is phrased as, how would you prioritize the importance of the following technology shortfall? And then the title again. So each of the questions is defaulted to no opinion in case you don't fill out that question or that section. And then you would click above each of the various scores that you would like to give that particular shortfall. So it ranges from 0, not important, minimally important, slightly, moderately, extremely, and then critically important would be a 9. At any time, if you want more information about the shortfall, you click on the little caret up here in the upper right next to the title, and you'll get that one-page description that Spud showed you. Over on the right-hand side of this page, it shows the 3 open-ended questions. The first one is, are there any shortfalls that you believe are missing? The second one is, are there any shortfalls that really shouldn't be shortfalls because the technology exists to close that, that shortfall? And then the third is very open-ended. Is there any other feedback that you'd like to provide relevant to the shortfalls? And again, remember to save your answers here. You can do a save and close and a submit. Next slide, please. Okay, so we can answer any questions you have now. Again, you would press the ellipses or the 3 dots down on the bottom right of your web browser to open the Q&A function and submit a question. Raise your hand with the icon kind of in the middle of the bottom bar to ask a question verbally, and don't forget to lower your hand. As we mentioned, if you think of something after the webinar, please reach out to the email address on the screen. And again, for civil servants and contractors, we request that you use the Spark mechanism within the agency. We'll be having a webinar for that mechanism tomorrow at noon Eastern time.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle.
I see several questions in the chat, and we also have a hand up. So I'm going to start with a couple in the chat here for you, Spuds. This first question from Dallas asks, different stakeholders will be interested in different technology areas. How will priorities in each be ranked across areas?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dallas. So you're right. That's actually the point of this, is because that's why we're also going to produce the data and show you how the different stakeholder groups answer these questions, because I think it's good insight for everybody for what the different perspectives are for everyone. So how will it get rolled up? Well, it'll be clear. You'll see the different stakeholder groups and how they ranked things, how things were rated, and then there'll be a convolved list. So you'll get to see both. You'll get to see how it's rolled up. Obviously, as I mentioned, sort of the stakeholders as you come back left from the public, architecting from the rightmost stakeholder is the public. They're the people paying the bills. As you come left from there, we've got the administrative side of the house. That's the Hill and White House. But then you've got the technology. Most of the people on here are down that path. And the principal stakeholders just to the left of the public are human exploration, science, and other government agencies. We're the tech base for civil space. So those stakeholders are going to weigh heavily, right? Then you've got the centers, the people who are now executing, centers, industry, academia. And then there's going to be other, I'm sure there's some stakeholder groups that we haven't binned properly yet. That's why there's another category as well. So you can identify who you are, and we'll make sure you're binned properly, how you're affiliated. But that's exactly the point, Dallas, is that we want to make sure that we're looking across and not just saying it's all rolled up into one big pile. We want to see what it looks like based on stakeholder category. It will, however, it will roll up into a convolved listing, prioritized list for us, because that's how we want to use this tool to wash our investments against what the community thinks as a whole. So by and large, if you've got something that's super important to human exploration, and you've got something and it's also very important to science, I guarantee it's going to rank very, very high, because those are our two biggest stakeholders.
All right, great answer. Thank you, Spides. Several questions along the lines of wanting to understand specifically how we're weighting. Another question from Danielle in the chat asks, will the shortfalls that cover several capability areas such as autonomy and excavation and construction weigh heavier in the prioritization of investments and projects?
The short answer is yes. Let me expand on that. In that heat map that I showed you, and it's a great question, Danielle. The heat map I showed you, as you go down one of those columns, when either an existing investment or any new ideas coming along will be mapped to the shortfalls, independent of how the shortfalls were prioritized. That's the process we're doing now. But when part of the ticket of getting into our headspace is going to be how did you map to solving those problems? Then when we've ranked, with your help, racked and stacked those shortfalls, a project, for example, that simultaneously attacks multiples of those 187 shortfalls is going to score higher, right, than something that is specifically geared toward one. However, it's not just that. When we talk about how we're going to rate things, we're also going to include what's the investment value, what's the TRL delta. All these we're going to get into later, and we'll talk about that in another venue. But right now, we're just harvesting the shortfalls. But the quick answer to your question is yes. All things being, if everything else is equal, if within one investment concept you're attacking multiple problems, that's obviously gonna play better for that particular investment.
All right, thank you, Spides. One more waiting question, and then I'll move to some hands. Craig in the chat asks, is there weighting for the scores offered by companies of different sizes? For example, if ULA says there's a shortfall in solid rocket booster derived applications, and some small company says we need more liquid propulsion applications, does each company have the same influence on the shortfall scoring?
Right. We actually talked about this, and we think that what we're going to end up doing at a minimum, we think the industry is going to be broken up probably into two stakeholder groups. When we originally went down this path, we thought of industry as a stakeholder group, but we really think it's going to be at least two.
Okay. All right. And let's move to some hands that I see raised. I think Michael Eads has his hand up if you'd like to unmute. Michael, are you there?
We see him speaking, but we don't hear him.
All right. Michael, I'm gonna take a question in the chat and then we'll come back to you. Let's see. What timeline should we think about when prioritizing? For example, for the next 5 years, or 5+, or etc. For example, initial prioritization could be more focused towards surface landing and operations versus long-term lunar surface mining. And this question is from Kenny in the chat.
So it's a fair question. I would encourage the following. So what we did is, when you look at how we're doing this, we weren't very specific about how you felt how important something was. So that's a good factor to consider. And if you think that there's something that is, you can see that one of two ways. If it's far enough out that you don't think it's a problem for a while, you might score it lower. on the other hand, you might say because it's something we need to make investments because the TRL is so low and it needs to be higher, and you see the path, it's part of the critical path that makes it critical. You might feel that that's much more important because of the time scale or the TRL advancement required, the risk that needs to be reduced, or the technology that needs to be matured, like now for something that's going to be needed in 20 years. And you can see that if we don't act now, we need to, that'll be a critical path item. So we are not being prescriptive about how you should rate something, but you can decide on your own whether what level of importance you assign a particular shortfall. And if that's a factor, I think that's exactly how you should score it. You don't have to explain it to us. You just score it appropriately.
Excellent. Thank you, Spuds. Let's try Michael Eads if you're still on. And okay. We do have another hand up from Dave Deagle, if you'd like to unmute.
Yep. So Dave Deagle from 3D Ceram. We do 3D printing of ceramics. So if we have a known shortfall with a known technology to solve the shortfall, but we haven't been able to get funding or get the right team of people together to kick this off, is there a process to sort of prioritize or speed that up?
I understand the question. I think so. That gets into the sort of the acquisition side of it, of like how we go about affecting the programs and the project ideas that we're gonna implement.
Sure.
So that's downstream of what we're talking about right now. The answer is yes. There should be plenty of avenues. If you've got, when you bring something from now on, what we're hoping people are going to do is they're going to when they bring an idea to the table, whether they're responding to an RFP or they've got some or any kind of unsolicited, any kind of suggestion you're bringing or proposal that you bring to NASA should have these shortfalls in mind and the level of connectedness to it. And we're going to be, so if you do that, I think that's what helps us work off the same language. This is how we're going to use this tool, by the way. Other people can choose to use this within their own communities as well. Even individual companies saying, how do we want to manage our own independent, our IRAD investments? You could use this tool for your own purposes when we produce the results in a month or so, month and a half. So that's downstream, Dave.
Okay.
All right, thank you. I wanted to note, I see several comments in the chat, either about potentially a shortfall that you didn't see identified or potentially a solution that you're not sure we're aware of. And I would encourage you in your survey results, there's the 3 open-ended questions at the end that ask questions along those lines. And I'd encourage you to submit that feedback there in your survey.
And I would actually distinguish even between those two. If it's a shortfall we missed, absolutely, because we want to include it in the shortfall surveys going forward. If it's in the solution space, I would say it's not necessarily the data we're trying to harvest right now. If you've got a solution to these shortfalls, but keep this in mind, keep in mind you want to use these shortfalls based on the going back to the way the question I just answered of Dave's, is keep that in mind when we're doing the solicitations to answer the questions in terms of the shortfalls that you're addressing.
Thank you. I see another question in the chat. Is the focus all of Moon to Mars, or is it across all of the different mission directorate areas?
It's the latter for sure. That's been something that there's been a misnomer that people think that what STMD its job as the tech base is only the tech base for human exploration, and that is just not true. We're the civil space tech base. So we are the tech base for human exploration, science, other government agencies doing, not necessarily in the national security space realm, but in the civil space realm.
All right, and you kind of just addressed this one, but perhaps you can elaborate. There's a question in the chat that asks, will there be opportunities for contractors to submit white papers related to the shortfalls, example, RFPs? If so, what is that timeline?
Yeah, it's very similar to some of the other questions. Anything getting into the solution space is the next chapter in this story. Right now, what we're trying to do is get our heads around the problem space and getting your help on that. So all the mechanisms that we have for figuring out where to make our investments, those are all part of the things that you're very familiar with, and we're gonna be using all of those tools and those mechanisms going forward still. It's just a matter of this now gives us a context that we're asking you to speak to us in when we get to those later chapters that we're all going to use.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Spuds.
By the way, Dallas had looks like Dallas had a follow-up. He's just confirming the answer to the question. I just wanted to answer Dallas.
There will be, yes, so there will be a weighted algorithm to get a single ranking in addition to the stakeholder rankings.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, I'm seeing a couple of logistical questions in here. What is the timeline, and is there a way to save my inputs to a file or print the inputs for later reference? Again, the timeline is that we would like your responses by May 13th. And you can save your inputs and come back to them. I'd have to check with our developers as to whether there's a way to easily export them, but you can certainly save them and copy them over yourself if you'd prefer. Let's see, there's a follow-on question for you, Spuds. What do you mean by solution space and problem space?
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, if I'm a visual person, so you're doing a lot of hand waving and holding objects in front of me and whatnot to talk about things. The solution space is the investment side, the programs, the projects, the widgets, the things we build, the actual investments that we make, as opposed to the problem space, which is what's motivating us, right? And so that's what these shortfalls are. These are the problems. This is the why. This is why we have a tech base, is to fill these, to solve these problems. Whereas the solution space is more of what you traditionally see out of us. It's the programs, the projects, the actual widgets that we're making and developing, the capabilities themselves.
All right, we have a question that says, we have a lot of people in our organization who would like to review this or take this survey. Is there a way that we can compile responses?
Three answers to that probably, right? One is, this is the first year we're doing it. It's going to be messy and clunky on the first year. And actually, I think everyone, the strategy and chief architect team did a really good job on short notice of putting this together, right? Having said that, we're going to evolve this process from year to year, because this will be an annual thing that we're going to do. But for this 1 year, there's a couple of ways you can do it. You can choose to, within your organization or company, you can choose to do your own survey amongst yourselves and then enter one convolved answer to us. And that can come in one of two forms, either one person putting it in, or if you're really, reach out to us and we'll figure out if there's a better way, that if there's some other way, that if there's a way you're trying to get us the data that it doesn't quite work on the tool. The other way to do it is you have all the individuals from your organization or company affiliate themselves when they go to fill in the survey. There's a place where they can sign in for who they're affiliated with, and we'll have all the data and we can consolidate it for your organization or company.
All right, thank you. I think I've taken all of the questions in our Q&A section. I see a hand up. Audrey Scott, would you like to unmute?
University of Chicago, focusing on millimeter wave cosmology. So really great to be able to hear all of this. Thank you. I think what my kind of question was, and I noticed obviously with many of these responses, there was an option to put no opinion, given that my areas and instruments. I was doing that in my preliminarily filling this out with a lot of sections, but I was kind of curious, given the comparative size of the science community as opposed to maybe the human exploration community, other aerospace, what kind of measures were in place to make sure that the algorithm still ranked science priorities appropriately as well? Thank you.
So the primary mechanism of making sure that we balance this properly is the fact that we're doing this annually. That's the first and most important answer, is that if we don't get it right this first year, because if in fact we were a little bit more heavily weighted towards human exploration, because over the last decade and a half, there was, as everybody knows, anybody who's been around NASA probably knows, there was a little bit of a, in the post Constellation era, there were definitely two different kinds of camps, two different flavors of NASA. There was a science side and a human exploration side. We're the tech base for both. And so and to the extent that if it's not represented, we've talked about this with our science mission directorate. If there's stuff that's missing or we haven't captured it properly, that's where you use those questions at the end and say, hey, you've missed something here. And over time, I think we're gonna balance this out better, right? So I can only answer for what we've gotten from our communities so far internally at NASA, but this whole process helps us balance it out by getting feedback. So if you think we're missing something, it would be very helpful to put that in. Give us that feedback.
All right, I see another question in the chat that I can try to answer, and Spud, you may want to elaborate on it. But it says, do you have any guidance on how to discriminate between critically, extremely, moderately, and slightly important? That's a good question. You will note that we included actually numerical scores associated with those critically, extremely, moderately, and slightly important. And those are the scores that we will assign as we go through the assessment process and determine rankings. So I would look at the scores and what that means to you. They're on a scale of 0 to 9. So consider that when you are deciding how to choose. And Spud's.
Yeah, I will say, and I see it's David Edwards asking the question too. Good to hear from you. I will say this: the short answer is no for cause. This is actually something we talked about. I've used a process similar to this in other national tech bases that when I was over on the DoD side as well, and we were very guarded about purposefully not trying to guide people or lead them down a path. It's basically what your impression is of the relative importance of a particular shortfall from your perspective. So we don't even need to hear why, because it's what is your opinion about it, right? How do you see it? How impactful or important do you think it is, right? And it can range over that whole scale, and different people do use different criteria, and that's okay. That's why we're doing this by individuals and stakeholder groups, so that we can tease that out a little bit. But that's why we actually don't give guidance, because I think we would end up, if we did, we would end up kind of tilting the results in a way that we don't intend to.
Right, thank you. Let's see, I have a question about how folks can find more information on the related shortfalls that may be showing on some of the shortfalls. Michelle, would you like to take that one?
Sure, I can take that one. The related shortfalls are not available with a full write-up. So really, I think they're helpful at the level of the titles. And so you can see how groups of shortfalls and their titles have been aggregated into that shortfall that you're seeing for the full description. The other place that you could get some related information is on our techport.nasa.gov/strategy page, where we have our STMD Envision Future Priorities packages. Those PowerPoint packages for each capability or technology area could help provide some more context for you. So really use those related shortfall titles as kind of clues as to some of the lower level details that show up in that shortfall. We plan to make the entire shortfall database accessible in the future after we get through this exercise. So I don't have a very definitive timeline on that, but that is a plan for the future.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. There is a question about, will this meeting recording be emailed to participants? And I'm getting a nod that we can, in fact, email it out to participants. I've got another question in the chat. Are the priorities and shortfalls also meant to help guide science calls within the Science Mission Directorate?
So that's a good question. This is intended to be a tool for whoever needs it for whatever purposes they need. These are not STMD's shortfalls. They're not the tech bases shortfalls. This is civil spaces shortfalls. So it can be used as a tool for whoever needs it. In fact, I use this example a lot. Forgive me for anyone who's heard me say this before, but in previous life where we've used something very similar in another tech base, the #1 ranked shortfall every year for like 4 straight years was not something that was the tech base's responsibility to attack. It was the test community had to solve that problem. And so, yeah, I would say the short answer to that question is, yeah, absolutely. The science community could use this to help with their own investments as well.
All right. Question from Danielle in the chat. Will the 600 and some shortfalls that were cut from the original 800 list be made available for viewing?
They weren't cut.
And I'd like to clarify that they weren't cut. Those shortfalls were just at a more granular level and have been rolled up into the 187 shortfalls here. So the content of the shortfalls themselves was not removed. We're just rolling it up to a higher level. And I think Michelle mentioned earlier that some of those you may find more contextual information about in the Envision Future Priorities presentations available on the TechPort site. Okay, there was a question about, can I save my inputs to a file or print the inputs for later reference? For the survey, again, you can go in and save your inputs at any time and come back to them. And I don't believe that there is functionality to easily export your inputs. But you can certainly copy and paste them into a document, and we can look into adding that functionality if that is something important to the community. There's a question here I see. What is the state of the art and technology readiness level considered to generate the shortfalls list? Michelle, would you like to answer that question?
I would say that a shortfall can result from a lack of technology readiness at any level, really. Usually from about 2 to 6, but that's not necessarily always the case. So these shortfalls have really been aggregated across our technical communities over the past 2 to 3 years by listening to input from industry and the public through RFIs that we did probably about 1.5 years ago on our Envision Future Priorities, and by working with our sister mission directorates inside the agency, predominantly science and exploration, to identify shortfalls that exist as the Moon to Mars architecture is being built out. So they don't really correspond to any particular technology readiness level.
Michelle, this is Spuds. I agree with that. As to put another emphasizing point on that is that, again, granted, this is the first year we're doing it, so it's very technology oriented, right? Because that's our motivation behind it. But I can see in future years as this evolves, as it's done in other places I've seen this, it doesn't always have to be about the technology. You can say we've got a problem in our ecosystem in this community, and that can actually end up on this list as well as a shortfall, right? Not necessarily, again, not necessarily our problem to solve, but at least we're identifying it as something. And then the office responsible for solving those problems is aware of it because they're actually involved in this community. They're part of the ecosystem. The other thing I will say, just to handcuff to that, is if it is a TRL 8 problem, it's like if it's already outside the tech base, that's a very specific example of what I'm just now saying. It may be a shortfall in operations, right? It may be a shortfall out at the program office that's beyond the tech base, but we're okay identifying it. It's just not our problem to solve necessarily. If it's beyond TRL 6, 7, it's not our problem. However, this is not our shortfall list. It's the big, German, our the overarching group, the entire community's shortfall list.
All right, thank you. I see one more question in the chat here. This survey is solely focused on prioritizing the gaps and shortfalls in terms of the difficulty of overcoming them, correct? And confirming we are not talking about solutions and investments yet, correct?
Yes. Second part, yes. I don't want to be prescriptive on the first part and saying the difficulty in overcoming them. It's more of the impact, right? You can determine the first part of that question. Is that Claire?
It came from a chat.
Oh, I was like, hey, same, your name too. The first part of that question is rooted in the same thing that Dave Edwards asked, which is we're not being prescriptive about how to answer that question of what makes it important from your perspective. All we care about is your perspective. As you look at what we're trying to do in human exploration science and the other civil space government agencies, how do you see the impactfulness, the importance of that problem? How problematic is the problem, basically, right? The second piece of that question, very much agree. Yes, we're not talking about the solutions investments at this time. That's what we're going to use this tool to wash the investments against.
Thank you, Greg, for the question.
Okay, I think we've covered the questions from the chat, and I do not see any hands up. We have a few minutes left.
There was one more.
Hey, while we're paused here for a second, I just wanted to note there were a couple items in the chat looking for specific shortfalls, and I would say a handy hint is to download the PDF that's available of the shortfall one-pagers and do some word searches on that, and you should be able to hopefully find what you're looking for. And if you can't, that's a hint that that's perhaps a missing shortfall that you could give us feedback on in one of the open-ended questions at the end of the questionnaire. Thanks.
Okay, I saw several new questions pop up here. What fiscal year do you expect this will inform?
25 and beyond. So we're halfway through 24 right now, so it's a little tough to make adjustments. And we're working through this process now, so it'd be unfair to try and claim that we're making adjustments to 24 based on that. However, we would like as best. That's why we're kind of pushing through this process so fast, is to get this started. It'll be, again, clunky, messy the first year, but we would really like to try and inform 25 if we can. What's handcuffed to this and the way we're organizing and whatnot is we were hoping for more discretion as well, so that we can move as ideas are coming in. We don't have to wait budget cycles to get things into our bloodstream, that we can actually look at these investments, see an opportunity, and move money around within our portfolio to start addressing these problems at the speed of contracting.
All right. Another question from Melena in the chat. What happens after 5/17? Which is when we will begin our assessment process. And we hope to publish the integrated priority list sometime this summer. So we plan on using the time thereafter to assess all of the inputs that we've received and determine our ranking based on some of how Spuds has described some of the weighting processes that we'll go through.
Yeah, there's two things, right? Exactly right, Allison. It's like, on one hand, we're going to produce for you what the shortfalls, what that prioritized list looks like, both as a convolved list as well as the stakeholder groups. At the same time, we're going to use those lists ourselves internally. It's a tool now available to everybody, that information, those prioritized lists. And now we're going to use that to map our investments, both existing and any new things coming down the pike, to map against those prioritized shortfalls. And so that process, and how we're doing that mapping, we're working through that right now, so that by the time 517 happens, we can hit the ground running.
So, there's some questions in here, a couple about if there are nuances to our perspective, what opportunity do we have to explain those nuances to help NASA better understand the problem space? As a follow-up, can a field be added to the survey for each shortfall to add a comment? And I can address that question. There is an open-ended question in the survey that says, is there any other feedback you'd like to provide us on our shortfalls? We've made sure that has a very high word limitation, so you may address those specific nuances in that last open-ended question.
Yeah, if I could,
go
sorry,
ahead, Michelle.
if I could add to that, we have had that question several times, and it's something we'll be considering for future years. This year, we were on a very tight schedule, so I appreciate that question. And so we would, suggest that perhaps you note the ID number of the shortfall you're referring to, and then add any clarifying commentary, as Allison said, in one of the open-ended text fields at the end. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Audrey asks, is there anything in the algorithm to work against potentially malicious low rankings as opposed to no opinion selections for areas a respondent doesn't have a stake in?
It's a good point, right? Yeah. We're other than we've got it right there. It's, in the tool, we try to distinguish the difference between a 0 and an NA. The NA is reserved for something that you don't feel that's something you have an opinion about or you're not qualified to, and 0 is I know exactly what it is and I do not think it's important at all, is what you're saying. It is a pretty extreme ranking. But it's a good point. Some folks could accidentally, I guess people could accidentally put 9s in there too. But your point, Audrey, is that Audrey, I can't read from back here, Audrey. So it's a good point that someone might mistake that. So it's a valid point.
Yeah, I think this is our first year through the process, and we're going to learn a lot as we go through the process. But that's the importance of also having human eyes on the assessment of the data, as well as not just looking at the numbers, so that we can, maybe infer out where that might be happening.
Yeah, and just to add, in case it wasn't clear in the charts, the rating, the score for each of the 187 shortfalls is defaulted at the beginning to not applicable or no opinion. So in order to be malicious and put a 0, you have to actually go and move the slider to the 0. So we're trying to protect against that as much as possible, at least erroneous selections.
Good answer, Michelle.
Okay, are there any other questions either in the chat or from our participants online?
Did you miss any?
All right, well, thank you so much for participating in our webinar today, and thank you so much for taking the time to go in and submit your feedback on our shortfalls. Again, the shortfall feedback form closes on May 13th. And as a reminder for our NASA folks online, please use the NASA Spark platform to submit your feedback. We will email out the recorded version of this webinar, and you are welcome to submit questions to this email address listed here. if we didn't answer your question, or if you have any, thoughts as you're going through the questionnaire. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.